He divorced me after 40 years of marriage and moved his new wife into our home, the same home where I painted the walls with my hands, cooked his favorite meals, and raised our children, the same house where I watched the sunrise through the kitchen window while he read his morning paper, before he ever knew another woman's name. I stood across the street that day, trembling but silent, watching him carry boxes, her boxes, into my home. My heart wasn't beating, it was screaming. Every step he took across that porch echoed like a betrayal I could feel in my bones. And then I saw her, young, beautiful, dressed in a robe I once owned. She turned and kissed him in the doorway, laughing, as if she hadn't just walked into the ashes of my life. Tell me, what would you do if the man you built your world around replaced you like you were just furniture that didn't fit his new decor? I didn't shout, I didn't cry, not then. I just stood there in the rain, clutching my umbrella as if it could protect me from the storm inside me. 40 years of love, memories, and sacrifices, all erased in a moment. He didn't just leave me, he erased me. And yet as I watched them, I realized something that hit me harder than his betrayal. The house still belonged to me, half of it legally. Every wall, every tile, every brick, my name was still there carved in ink and ownership. He might have moved her in, but I wasn't gone. Not yet. You see, pain can do one of two things to a woman. It can destroy her, or it can awaken something fierce, something dangerous, something that no one sees coming. That night, I went home to my small apartment, the one I'd rented after he threw me out, and I sat in silence. No music, no TV, just the sound of my own heartbeat, steady and strong. I stared at the old family photos stacked in boxes, pictures of weddings, birthdays, Sunday mornings. I remembered how he used to look at me like I was the only woman in the world, how his hand fit perfectly in mine, how he once swore, "Till death do us part," but death didn't separate us. Disrespected. And that's when it hit me. This wasn't about him anymore. It was about me, about reclaiming the woman I had buried under 40 years of being a good wife, a good mother, a good everything, but never myself. People think revenge is loud. It's shouting, breaking, destroying. But they're wrong. Real revenge is quiet. It's calm. It's a woman sipping tea while the world wonders what she's planning. So, I planned. I didn't want to hurt him. I wanted to remind him who I was before he forgot. Remind him that the woman he discarded still had fire left in her bones. He thought I'd disappear into bitterness. He thought I'd cry myself to sleep. But instead, I started making calls. And while he slept next to his new wife under my roof, I made the decision that would change everything. He took my love for granted. He took my loyalty for weakness. But soon he'd learn the truth, that I might have been the woman he walked away from, but I was also the woman who could take everything he thought was his.
Because when a woman's heart hardens, when the tears dry and the pain turns into purpose, nothing and no one can stop her. So if you think this story is about heartbreak, it's not. It's about rebirth, about strength, about a quiet, poetic kind of justice. And by the end of this story, you'll understand exactly why I sold the house while they were sleeping. I still remember the first time I met him. It wasn't love at first sight, not the dramatic kind they show in movies, but it was something softer, something real. He was standing by the corner store, holding a bag of apples for his mother, smiling at a stranger like he had all the time in the world. His shirt was half tucked in, his hair too long, but his eyes were kind. That kindness drew me in like sunlight through a window. I was 20 then, young, shy, and full of dreams. He was 23, Confident but gentle. The kind of man who said please and thank you, even to the waiter. We talked about everything that day. Music, life, the future. And before I knew it, weeks turned into months, and months into a promise. I'll never leave you, no matter what. How easy it is to believe in forever when you're young. We built our life from scratch. No luxury, no help, just long hours and hard work. We bought a small piece of land and, brick by brick, turned it into our dream home. He mixed the cement, I painted the walls. The kitchen was my kingdom. The backyard was his. Together, we made it beautiful. That house saw everything. Our children's first steps, the fights we never talked about again, the laughter that echoed through the halls. It wasn't perfect, but it was ours. He used to come home smelling of sawdust and rain, wrapping his arms around me and saying, "This is what happiness feels like." And I believed him. For decades, I believed him. We raised 2 children under that roof, a boy and a girl. They grew, they left, they built their own lives. And when they did, it was just us again. 2 old souls sitting by the porch in the evenings, sipping tea and talking about everything and nothing. We had small rituals. He'd read the newspaper out loud to me, even when my eyes could see just fine. I'd make his tea exactly how he liked it. 2 sugars, 1 secret smile. Sometimes I'd catch him looking at me like he did when we first met, and I'd think, maybe this is what love looks like when it grows old. But somewhere between the ordinary days and the silent nights, something changed. It started small. The way he'd flinch when I touched his shoulder, the phone calls he'd take outside, the way he'd laugh a little too hard at his messages. I told myself I was imagining it, that after 40 years, a man couldn't just drift away. But he did. One morning, I found a lipstick stain on his collar. It wasn't mine. When I asked, he laughed it off. He said, "You're being paranoid." Paranoid. Such an easy word to silence a woman's intuition. I tried to hold on. I cooked his favorite meals. I smiled through the pain. I told myself, maybe it's just a phase. But deep down I knew. The house started to feel colder, the laughter thinner. He'd stay out late saying he was busy, and when he did come home, he'd smell of perfume that wasn't mine. The night he confessed, it was raining, just like the day I met him. He didn't cry. He didn't even look sorry. He just said, "I found someone else. I want a divorce." 40 years. 4 decades of love, loyalty, and sacrifice ended in 5 words. I didn't scream. I didn't beg. I just nodded, because sometimes silence is the only dignity a broken heart can afford. The papers came a week later. The lawyer talked about numbers, assets, equitable division. But how do you divide 40 years of life? How do you split laughter, dreams, and the smell of morning coffee shared between 2 people? In the end, I got half of everything. Half the money, half the house, half the memories. But what good is half a life? He moved out for a while. I stayed in the house alone, trying to make peace with the ghosts of what we used to be. The walls still smelled like him. The garden still bloomed the way he liked it. Every corner whispered his name, until the day I drove past the house and saw them there.
Her car in the driveway, her clothes are hanging on the line. My home, their new nest. He had moved her into the same house I built with my own hands, the same walls where I carried our children in my arms.
It felt like being erased, not just from his life, but from my own story. For days, I couldn't eat. I couldn't sleep. My mind kept replaying it, her laughter in my kitchen, her shoes by my door, her hands on his face. I wanted to hate her, but mostly I pitied her. Because one day, she'd see the same look in his eyes that I once did, that distant coldness when he decides he's done. Still, the pain burned like wildfire, until it turned into something else. Resolve. He had taken everything, my love, my home, my peace, but not my power. I decided that if he wanted to build a new life inside my home, then he could do it somewhere else, because that house was still half mine. And if I couldn't live there anymore, then neither could they. And that, my dear listener, was the night I stopped being the heartbroken wife and became the woman who planned her quiet, perfect revenge. For a few days after seeing them in my home, I couldn't breathe properly. I'd wake up in the middle of the night drenched in sweat, my heart pounding, hearing sounds that weren't there, her laughter echoing in my kitchen, his voice calling her darling the way he once called me. I tried to convince myself it wasn't real, but every time I drove past, the reality stared back at me. They were living my life in my house. That house was more than walls and bricks. It was the story of my life. I had chosen every curtain, every plate, every flower in the garden. There was a dent in the hallway from when our son rode his first bicycle indoors, a stain on the kitchen counter from my daughter's first attempt at baking. Every mark, every scratch, a memory. And now they were walking all over them like none of it ever mattered. The betrayal wasn't just his affair. It was the audacity to replace me in the same space I built with love. I spent my days in silence, replaying 40 years of memories like a movie that wouldn't stop. Every anniversary dinner, every whispered promise, every time he said, "You're my forever." Now, forever is gone. One evening, I sat on the floor surrounded by old photo albums. His smile in those pictures felt like a stranger's. I ran my fingers over the photos, wondering, was he pretending all along, or did love simply die a slow, quiet death while I wasn't looking? That night, something shifted inside me. The sadness began to harden. I wasn't the kind of woman who screamed or broke things. I'd always been the calm one, the one who held the family together, who smiled through storms. But calm doesn't mean weakness. I started thinking, carefully, quietly. When we divorced, the house was still under both our names. Legally, half of it was mine. I never cared to fight for it, not until now. I called my lawyer. His voice was cautious, polite. Technically, Mrs. Hale, you still own 50% of that property. You can sell your share, but... He paused. But what? I asked. Well, if you sell your share to a buyer, they'd become a co-owner, unless you sell the entire property outright. And I can do that? With his signature, yes. I thanked him, hung up, and stared at the wall for a long time. My ex-husband, was arrogant. He believed I'd never have the courage to act. He saw me as the quiet wife who'd fade into the background while he played house with someone else. He'd forgotten that I built that home from dust and sacrifice. The next morning, I went to the property office. My hands were trembling as I held the papers, reading line after line of legal jargon. But buried in those pages was my lifeline, my power. I didn't need revenge through words. I needed justice through action. Weeks passed as I gathered information quietly. I didn't tell the children. I didn't tell my friends. I simply watched. They hosted parties in that house, my house. They redecorated the living room. The woman even painted over my mural, the one I made for our daughter when she was a child. I remember standing there one afternoon, watching from the street, seeing the pink curtains where my lace ones used to hang, and something inside me whispered, Take it back. I started preparing. I met with a realtor, an old friend of mine named Nancy. She'd known me for years and didn't ask too many questions. I want to sell the house, I told her. Your half? She asked. No, I said softly. The whole thing.
She frowned. Does he know? Not yet. Her eyebrows shot up, but she didn't argue. You'll need his signature. I smiled. Leave that to me. I knew my ex-husband still received property-related mail at his old address, my new apartment. When the property tax notice arrived, I took it as my chance. I drafted a few papers, disguised among routine documents that required his quick signature for a small update to our joint deed. I sent them to him through the mail with a note written in my usual polite handwriting. He signed them, without even reading. It was both funny and tragic. The man who betrayed me didn't even have the time to read what he was agreeing to. He trusted me not to fight back. He always did. Once the papers came back, Nancy got to work. Within weeks, there was a buyer, a quiet man who wanted to move abroad and rent the property out. The offer was fair, the timing perfect. The night before the sale, I drove past the house one last time. The lights were on. I could see them through the window, eating dinner at my table, sitting where I once sat. They looked happy, almost smug. And I realized they thought they had won. But the sale went through at midnight. By morning, the house legally belonged to someone else. I didn't tell them. Not yet. I wanted them to wake up to it. That night, I barely slept. I kept checking the clock, feeling both nervous and calm. Revenge doesn't always roar. Sometimes it whispers, steady and deliberate. At dawn, I poured myself a cup of tea and waited for the phone call. It came just after 8 a.m. My ex-husband's voice was half asleep, panicked. "What did you do?" he shouted. I smiled, slow and tired. "I sold our house," I said. "You can't do that." "Oh, but I already did." There was silence on the other end, the kind that carries years of disbelief. He sputtered something about lawyers, legality, fairness, but all I said was, "You wanted a new life? Now you can start from somewhere new." Then I hung up. For the first time in years, I felt free. I stood by the window watching the sunrise and realized that revenge wasn't about hurting him. It was about reclaiming me. The pain didn't disappear overnight. There were still moments when I missed the old us, the laughter, the shared dreams. But I knew now that what I missed wasn't him. It was the version of myself who believed love meant surrender. Not anymore. Because that morning, I finally understood something powerful. Sometimes closure doesn't come from forgiveness. Sometimes it comes from walking away, knowing you ended the story on your own terms. For a long time, I thought that revenge would make me feel triumphant. I imagined I'd laugh, maybe even celebrate after selling that house. But when the sun rose that morning and the papers were signed, all I felt was quiet, a heavy, sacred quiet, like the silence that comes after a storm. My phone kept ringing, unknown numbers, lawyers probably. Then his name appeared. I didn't answer. He sent messages, angry, desperate, then pleading. "You've gone mad," one said. "You ruined me," another said. The last one was just, "Why would you do this to me?" Funny. After 40 years, he finally asked me a question. Not because he cared, but because he couldn't believe I'd found my strength. By noon, my daughter came to see me. She looked torn, eyes red, lips trembling. "Mom," she whispered, "Dad's furious. He said you sold the house out of spite." I smiled faintly. "No, dear,
I sold it out of self-respect. She sat across from me, shaking her head. But you loved that house. I did, too much. That's why I had to let it go. She didn't understand, not yet. To her, it looked like bitterness, but it wasn't. It was release. The house had become a monument to my pain, and by letting it go, I was finally freeing myself from the ghost of a long-dead marriage. Later that evening, my son called. His tone was colder. "Mom, how could you do that to Dad?" I could almost laugh. "To Dad?" I said. Softly. "The man who moved his new wife into my home while my things were still inside." He hesitated. "You should have talked to us first."
And what would you have said? I asked. That I should keep quiet, keep suffering to keep the peace? There was silence. Then he said something that stung more than it should have. "You've changed, Mom." I looked out the window, at the fading sunset. "No," I said. I finally stopped pretending. When the children left that night, I sat alone in the dim light of my living room. My tea had gone cold, untouched. I wasn't angry. I was just empty. I had given 40 years of loyalty, of love, of care, and yet, at the end of it, I was the villain for daring to stand up for myself. But deep down, I knew something they didn't. Sometimes the ones who break free are the ones who are most misunderstood. The following week, my ex-husband came to see me. I heard his car before I saw him, the same one we'd bought together years ago. He stepped out, older, worn, with that same arrogant confidence, but a shadow behind his eyes. He didn't ask to come in. He just stood there at the door, angry but uncertain. "You didn't have to humiliate me," he said. "Humiliate you?" I asked, almost gently. "You brought another woman into my house, into our home. You humiliated us." He looked down, jaw tight. "You are always dramatic. And you always underestimated me." For a moment, neither of us spoke. The silence between us felt like 40 years of conversations we never had. Finally, he said, "You'll regret this." I smiled, calm and steady. "No, I regret wasting my best years on a man who thought I'd never fight back." He left soon after, slamming the door so hard that the picture frames rattled. But I didn't flinch. That door had closed once before. This time, it would stay shut. Days passed, weeks even. News of the sale spread through our small town faster than wildfire. Neighbors whispered, some in sympathy, others in awe. A few even called me bold, which made me laugh. Bold? No, I was just done being small. But then something unexpected happened. One afternoon, I received a letter from the woman he left me for. It was handwritten, neat and polite. It began, "I don't know what to say. I didn't know he would do this to you, or me. We're moving out. I can't live in that house. It doesn't feel like mine." I read it twice, then set it aside. I didn't feel satisfaction or triumph, but only a strange peace. She wasn't my enemy. She was just another woman who believed his lies, like I once did. That night, as I sat by the window, watching the streetlights flicker, I thought about forgiveness. Not for him, but for myself. For all the times I stayed silent, for all the times I put my happiness second to someone else's comfort. And that's when I realized something powerful. Selling that house wasn't revenge. It was a declaration. A message to every woman who's been made to feel disposable after giving her all. You are not replaceable. You are reclaimable. I started doing small things for myself. Repainting my apartment,
planting herbs on the balcony, cooking meals just for one. It felt strange at first, but beautiful too, like rediscovering a forgotten song. My children eventually came around. My daughter called one day and said, "Mom, I think I get it now." I said, "What do you mean?" "You weren't angry. You were healing." I smiled, tears in my eyes. "Yes, my dear. Sometimes healing looks like revenge, but it's really just courage in disguise." By then, even my son had softened. He stopped defending his father and started visiting more often. One evening, he brought his own little girl along, and as I watched her play on the carpet, I thought, maybe this is what freedom looks like. Not loud, not dramatic, just quiet peace. Still, every once in a while, I drive past the old house. It looks smaller now, somehow. I don't feel the sting anymore, just gratitude for the woman I became after losing everything. Because when he took the house, the love, the future I'd imagined, I thought I'd lost my story. But in truth, I had only just begun writing it. After the house was gone and the storm settled, I felt the quiet in a way that was almost shocking. The air seemed sharper, crisper somehow, and the echo of my own footsteps in the empty apartment was startling. It was a silence I wasn't used to. No creaking floors, no muffled conversations behind closed doors, no arguments simmering in the background. Just me and the faint smell of old dust that lingered in the corners. I wandered from room to room,
touching the walls, the remnants of my life scattered like breadcrumbs I would never follow again. For the first time in decades, it felt like I could breathe. And then, almost as if the universe had been waiting, women began to reach out to me. At first, it was sporadic. A neighbor knocking with a small plate of cookies. A letter slipped under my door. A stranger sending a long message on social media. But soon, the messages grew more frequent, more urgent, more desperate. They all said the same thing in their own words. "You did what I always wished I could do." I didn't know how to respond. I wasn't a hero. I wasn't brave in the way people imagined. I was just a woman who had finally reached her breaking point. But as I listened to their stories, a pattern emerged. I had done more than reclaim my life. Somehow, my small act of defiance had given them permission to reclaim theirs. Margaret was my next-door neighbor, a woman with warm eyes that had grown cautious over 30 years of marriage. Her husband controlled everything: the finances, her friends, even her wardrobe. She had always been polite, smiling in the hallways, exchanging pleasantries, but I had never really known her until that day at the grocery store when she saw me and practically ran across the aisle. She hugged me so tightly I could barely breathe. She smiled with joy. "You made me remember who I used to be," she whispered. I felt tears sting my own eyes. Weeks later, she filed for separation, started her own catering business, and told me she hadn't felt this alive in decades. I watched her rebuild herself in small increments, learning to drive again, wearing clothes she liked instead of what was expected, laughing freely at dinners with friends she had once feared inviting. Then there was Rosa, a kind woman from church. She had lost her husband to illness, only to discover he had been hiding another family. I remember the day she came to me, eyes swollen from crying, clutching a small bag as if it contained all her courage. "I wanted to burn everything he left behind," she admitted, voice trembling. But I didn't have the courage. When she heard my story, it was like a light turned on. She sold her old house, moved to another town, and opened a small floral shop. The last time we spoke, she said, "I used to cry every morning. Now I wake up excited to see my flowers bloom." Her joy was contagious, and I realized that pain shared becomes lighter. When we speak our truth, it doesn't just free us, it frees others. There were so many others.
Women from my past, women I had never met before, women I thought I might never know. A coworker trapped in a marriage where her husband dictated every move. A neighbor hiding the bruises behind her long sleeves. A friend crushed by financial manipulation and years of small betrayals. Each story mirrored my own in some ways, yet each was unique in its horrors and triumphs. And each, like a fragile butterfly, emerged from hiding when they felt seen. Of course, not everyone understood. There were whispers. Some called me cold, even cruel. "Why didn't you forgive me?" they asked. "Why did you go so far?" I used to care what people thought. I would lie awake at night, questioning myself, wondering if I was wrong. But eventually, I learned to see it differently. Sometimes people confuse boundaries with bitterness. They expect women to bleed gracefully, but when we finally stop bleeding, they call it vengeance. I remember one woman, someone I had known casually for years, calling me after the sale. "I just don't understand," she said. "Was it necessary? Couldn't you have worked it out?" I didn't respond immediately. Instead, I let her words settle. And then I understood that my life wasn't for her or anyone else to judge. My life was mine. One afternoon, I was invited to speak at a small women's group. I hesitated at first. Me? Speaking publicly? My hands shook at the thought, and I paced in front of the mirror, rehearsing and erasing sentences repeatedly. But something inside urged me to go. The room was modest, soft lighting, chairs in a loose circle, the scent of coffee hanging in the air. I began to speak, not with anger, not with triumph, but with honesty. I spoke about betrayal, the quiet nights, and the fear of being forgotten. And when I reached the part about selling the house, there was silence, then applause. Not for the act itself, but for the courage it took to stop living for someone else. Afterward, an older woman approached me. Her silver hair framed her face, and her eyes were kind, yet piercing. She held my hand for a long time before she spoke. "My husband left me years ago. He took everything, the car, the savings, even my wedding ring. But what he couldn't take was my will to survive. You reminded me of that." Her words stayed with me, because maybe that's what this whole story was about. Survival. Not the loud, dramatic kind. The quiet kind that happens in small acts of self-respect. Signing a paper, saying no, walking away. Over time, I began to see a pattern. So many women around me had similar stories, but no one spoke them aloud. They carried their pain like a secret, believing it made them weak. But when I looked into their eyes, I saw strength, raw, ancient, beautiful strength, the kind that builds nations, raises families, survives wars. And it broke my heart to realize how often that strength is hidden beneath shame. I remember one evening at the park. I met a young woman sitting alone on a bench, crying quietly. I recognized her. She used to be a friend of my daughter's. I sat beside her, offered her a tissue, and waited. After a while, she whispered, "He left me. Said he wanted someone younger. I feel like my life's over." I smiled sadly. "My dear, I thought my life was over too. But sometimes endings are just disguised beginnings." She looked at me, confused. "How did you move on?" "I didn't," I said gently. "I rebuilt it." That's the truth no one tells you. Moving on isn't about forgetting. It's about rebuilding from what's left. Stronger, wiser, softer where it matters, harder where it doesn't. I started writing again. Small journal entries at first, then letters I never sent. In those words, I found myself healing, piece by piece. I wrote about the day I first met him, how handsome he looked, how certain I was that love would last forever. I wrote about the early days of our marriage, when laughter came easily and the world felt wide open. And then I wrote about the quiet years, when love turned into duty and duty into silence.
By the time I reached the end of the notebook, I realized something incredible. I wasn't writing about him anymore. I was writing about myself. My life didn't end when he left. It began. I started traveling. Nothing extravagant, just small trips. A weekend by the sea, a few days in the mountains, walks through quiet towns where no one knew my story. Each trip was a little act of freedom. Each sunrise was a quiet reward for the nights I had cried. My new apartment, small but bright, began to feel like mine. Not ours, not his, just mine. I painted the walls, arranged my furniture, hung curtains that I chose, not ones chosen by anyone else. Every detail was a tiny rebellion, a statement of ownership over my life. One day, as I hung new curtains, my granddaughter asked, "Grandma, why did you sell your old house?" I paused, smiled, and knelt beside her. "Because, sweetheart," I said, "because sometimes you have to let go of a house to save the person who lived in it." She didn't fully understand, but she hugged me anyway. And in that moment, surrounded by light, laughter, and the scent of new beginnings, I realized something profound. The best revenge is living well, without bitterness, without needing anyone to see your strength, because you finally see it yourself. So yes, maybe I sold the house while they were sleeping, but in truth, I was the one who finally woke up. After the house was sold and the dust finally settled, I found myself staring out the window for hours, watching the light shift across the city streets. The sun slanted in warm, golden streaks, illuminating the corners of my new apartment. Shadows of trees danced along the walls. Birds chirped in a rhythm that felt almost orchestrated, as if nature itself were celebrating my quiet freedom. The anger that had once consumed me, the rage that kept me awake at night, the bitterness that felt like a constant weight on my chest, had faded. It hadn't disappeared entirely, of course. Pain leaves traces. But those traces were no longer chains. They were footprints, tiny, delicate marks that reminded me of where I had walked, how far I had come, and how much strength I had carried without even realizing it. I realized then that life doesn't hand you clarity on a silver platter. Clarity has to be earned. You have to dig through rubble, sift through broken pieces, and find the shards of truth hidden beneath fear, shame, and disappointment. Sometimes the path to understanding yourself is less about gaining wisdom and more about surviving the wreckage. One of the hardest truths I learned is that betrayal doesn't define you, your response does. 40 years of marriage taught me love, compromise, patience, and quiet endurance. 40 years of mornings waking to familiar routines, evenings listening to the same old creaks and sighs, decades of effort put into sustaining a life with someone who was supposed to be my partner. And then, in a moment that felt like the ground beneath me had collapsed, everything changed.
But here's the thing, it wasn't the end. Not really. What seemed like destruction at first glance was an invitation. An invitation to reclaim myself, to rediscover a life I had neglected while fulfilling the roles everyone else expected me to play. I started noticing patterns, not just in my life, but in the lives of other women around me. So many were trapped in assigned roles: wife, mother, caretaker, and sometimes prisoner. They had folded themselves into obligations so deeply that their own voices were barely audible even to themselves. And in that silence, I recognized something familiar. The quiet suffocation of a life lived in service to others at the expense of your own self. The realization shifted everything. I began asking questions I had never dared ask before. Why do we forgive when we are bleeding inside? Why do we stay when leaving could save us? Why do we measure our worth by someone else's approval instead of our own? These questions weren't rhetorical. I sat with them in the quiet of my apartment, letting them echo through my mind, turning them over like stones in my hand. I didn't always have answers, but I did have courage. Enough courage to start living differently, to test boundaries I had never dared to set, and to rebuild a sense of self that had been buried under decades of expectation. The first step was terrifying, saying no to people who drained me, saying yes to experiences that nourished me. A friend invited me to a small concert, and I went alone. A neighbor asked me to join a cooking club, and I hesitated, then accepted. I began taking morning walks in parks I had passed by without noticing for years, letting sunlight brush against my skin as if it were acknowledging my newfound freedom. Slowly, the weight of expectation lifted. Every small act of courage, refusing a dinner I didn't want to attend, buying a dress just for myself, reading books that interested me rather than what someone else deemed appropriate, became an affirmation. I was reclaiming ownership of my life, and it was intoxicating. And then something remarkable happened. People noticed. Friends reached out. Younger women sought advice. Strangers would stop me in the supermarket or the park, saying things like, "I wish I had your strength," or "You give me hope." I realized in that moment that courage is contagious. When we step into our own power, even quietly, we give permission for others to step into their own. And so in reclaiming my life, I unknowingly created ripples of possibility. I was no longer just surviving for myself. My choices were lighting paths for others. Of course, the idea of revenge had crossed my mind. Selling the house had seemed like a bold act, and in some eyes, perhaps a spiteful one, but it wasn't about hurting anyone. It was about reclaiming my life, reclaiming agency over a past that had tried to define me. In that act, I discovered something unexpected: peace. True, quiet, unshakable peace. It wasn't loud or dramatic. It didn't need validation. It was the kind of serenity that comes from finally aligning your actions with your truth. I learned something profound. Life is mostly about perspective. If I had focused solely on betrayal, on injustice, on what was taken from me, I would have stayed angry, bitter, and small. But when I focused on what I could control, myself, my choices, my future, my happiness, the world expanded. Doors opened in places I hadn't dared to look before. Opportunities appeared where there had been only walls. I began sharing my story, quietly at first, then more openly, not to boast, not to shame, but to illuminate. I wanted women, especially those who had been silenced, neglected, or overlooked, to know that they were not alone. Pain is universal. Struggle is universal. But so is the capacity to rise, to reclaim, to thrive. I would meet women for coffee in small gatherings, even at the park, and listen. Some spoke haltingly, unsure if their pain mattered. Others cried openly, relieved that someone finally understood. And each time I saw the power of story, how sharing it could light courage in another person's heart. Through reflection, I also understood the importance of boundaries. People often confuse love with sacrifice. They believe that loving someone means losing themselves. But love without boundaries is not love. It's self-erasure. And when you protect yourself, the love you deserve can finally enter your life. I began mentoring other women. We shared stories, celebrated victories, cried together, laughed together. It was a network of quiet rebellion against the culture that tells women to shrink themselves, to fade, to endure endlessly. Every act of reclamation, no matter how small, became a victory. I reflected on forgiveness, too, not the hollow kind that erases injustice, but the kind that frees you from bitterness. I didn't forgive him to make him right. I forgave him to make me whole. And that decision changed everything. Nights became quieter, sleep deeper, laughter louder, life fuller. Looking forward, I found balance in small joys and big dreams. Mornings spent walking, afternoons reading on my balcony, evenings savoring tea as sunlight faded. These were sacred rituals of self-respect. Trips I had long denied myself became milestones of freedom. And the big dreams, writing, speaking, traveling, mentoring, these were no longer fantasies, but goals. Life is too short to settle, too precious to waste on grudges or guilt. The hidden truth I wanted everyone to understand is simple. Strength is not measured by endurance alone. It is measured by the courage to transform pain into purpose, betrayal into self-respect, endings into beginnings. We survive. We rebuilt. We rise. Not to spite, not to prove, but to honor the life we were always meant to live. Looking back, the house, the marriage, the betrayal, none of it mattered as much as the lessons. We are never too old to start over, never too hurt to heal, never too lost to find ourselves. Each morning, I wake with quiet gratitude. Gratitude for pain, because it taught resilience. Gratitude for betrayal, because it taught clarity. Gratitude for solitude, because it taught self-worth. Gratitude for the life I finally get to live fully, freely, fearlessly. As the sun rises over my small apartment, I smile. Few understand this. The true power of a woman is not in what she can endure, but in how beautifully she can rise after everything tries to break her.
As I sit back and reflect on everything that happened, the divorce after 40 years, the betrayal, the shock of seeing a new life move into the home I built with my own hands, I realize how much this journey has changed me. At first, all I felt was anger, confusion, and heartbreak. How could someone I trusted for decades suddenly erase the life we built together? How could someone so familiar become so foreign overnight? And yet, through the pain, I discovered a truth I wish I had learned sooner. Our worth is never tied to the approval or betrayal of others. It is inherent, unshakable, and ours alone.
I want every woman watching this, every person who has been hurt, humiliated, or underestimated, to understand this. You have the power to reclaim your life, even when the world feels stacked against you. You don't need permission. You don't need validation. You only need courage. And yes, sometimes a little bit of audacity. Courage to stand. Courage to act. Courage to rebuild. Selling the house while they slept wasn't just about reclaiming property. It was a statement to myself first, to the world second. It said, I am here. I am capable. I will not be diminished. And in that act, I found a peace that anger could never give me. Peace that came from knowing I was choosing myself, finally, unapologetically, and fiercely. I want you to know that life doesn't end when betrayal strikes or when the people you love fail you. Life is messy, complicated, and sometimes unbearably cruel, but it is also full of second chances, hidden opportunities, and moments of quiet victory. Each challenge you face is a chance to learn something about yourself, something no one else can teach. It's in these moments that we discover our resilience,
our creativity, and our strength. And here's something most people don't talk about. Freedom feels different than revenge. Revenge is loud, fleeting, and hollow. Freedom, real freedom, is quiet, enduring, and deeply satisfying. When you take control of your own life, make choices for your own happiness, and refuse to be defined by someone else's decisions, you experience a power that no betrayal can touch. That power is yours to keep. As I look toward the future, I see a life rich with possibilities. I see mornings where I sip tea in peace, evenings where I laugh without guilt, and adventures I never allowed myself before. I see a life where I mentor, inspire, and uplift others who feel trapped or silenced. And I see the ripple effect of courage. When one person chooses herself, it gives permission for countless others to do the same. So if you are watching this and feeling lost, trapped, or hurt, know this: your story is not over. Your power is not gone. And your life can be extraordinary if you decide to claim it. Don't wait for someone to give you permission. Don't wait for circumstances to be perfect. Start now. Start today. Start by believing in yourself, trusting your instincts, and taking one brave step forward. And remember, it's not about proving anyone wrong. It's about proving yourself right. It's not about getting back at someone. It's about getting back to yourself. Every small victory, every courageous choice, every moment you refuse to shrink yourself adds up. And one day, you'll look back and realize that the life you built for yourself on your own terms is more beautiful than anything anyone else could have given you. If my story resonates with you, I want you to take one small action right now. Acknowledge your worth, honor your courage, and decide on one thing you will do today to take control of your life. It could be a phone call, a decision, a step toward a dream you've shelved for too long. That one small action will start a ripple that changes everything. If you enjoyed this story and want more real-life tales of courage, resilience, and transformation,
Make sure to subscribe to Grandma's Silent Truths.
like this video and share your thoughts in the comments below. I read every single one, and your stories inspire me just as much as I hope mine inspires you. Don't miss the next video. It's coming soon, and it's another story that will remind you that strength isn't loud, it's quiet, and it's unstoppable. Remember, you are never too old, too hurt, or too lost to rise again. Your life is yours. Claim it, live it, love it.